Turkey intercepted a ballistic missile from Iran. Could the conflict in the Middle East become a big war? And how is Putin using the fact that Trump is now focused on Iran? We'll talk about this with Andrij Dobriansky, expert at Center for U.S.-Ukrainian Relations. Mr. Dobriansky, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me back on. Thank you.
So by striking Iran, the United States also struck China. Do you agree with this idea?
I think that's a little too far-fetched. I know that we've been trying to make the case, both the United States, Ukraine, and others, about the implication of China in the conflict against Ukraine. However, doing these secondary, tertiary means of including other countries into the conflict won't really end up getting the United States anywhere. In the end, the United States is looking at completing this operation as quickly as possible, and whatever after effects investigations of China or other countries' involvement, that'll happen after the fact. The most important thing for President Trump is to finish this as soon as possible, because he does not want to have more American soldiers killed, more American lives put in danger, either in the neighboring countries where Americans have been left stranded, or in the American homeland where the terrorism alert has gone up incredibly over the last several days.
And I'd like to hear from you the common situation in the Middle East. What do you think about this operation? More details, maybe.
Well, I think it's more details is what is needed by the American public. Both the American public and the rest of the world were taken by surprise when this attack was launched on Friday, well, Saturday already in most of the world. And there was no explanation. The president spoke for 2 hours on Tuesday night, a week ago, to the American public, to the entire world, and only mentioned Iran 3 times within one paragraph. This is not an explanation to the American public, as was done in the run-up to the Iraq War, the first Iraq War, the second Iraq War. Anytime a special operation was launched in other countries by the president, there's been an address to the American public explaining why this is happening. And in this case, it's not just a special operation, but a full war, even though the United States is sort of in this Mobius loop of not quite understanding or explaining to the American public that they were actually defending the potential attack that was coming on the United States after an attack was made against Iran, which was coordinated with the United States and yet wasn't made by the United States, and therefore they had to attack first. All of these explanations are found wanting at this point, and in the end, the fact that they can't explain why we went into war means that we don't have a valid reason why we will end this war, and that's a more puzzling and problematic issue for the United States.
As I understand, the ordinary Americans support Trump's Middle East policy.
Well, we have actually a lot of people in the polling saying that they are almost immediately not in favor of a long war. In fact, one of the key platforms for President Trump's reelection was no war in Iran specifically. So not only was no explanation given to the United States and the world in general, but to the supporters of President Trump. These are the supporters that he's going to turn to reelect his members of Congress and Senate in November, and that he will want to have on his side. That's an issue for President Trump, because the public polling now shows that independent voters, these are the key people that you want to win over in every midterm election. Those who aren't registered as Democrats or Republicans, those who make up their minds the week of or the day of an election. Right now, in public polling, those voters are not in favor of this war. This war has not been explained to them, and they do not understand why the United States is getting itself involved in yet another protracted Middle Eastern military intervention.
And how do you assess Europe's support for the operation in the Middle East?
Well, we've seen a lot of different rhetoric. At the very beginning, Europe was as surprised as many people in the United States and the rest of the world. However, after some of their citizens came under fire in different countries in the Middle East, we've seen a change of position by the United Kingdom, by Italy, by other countries, notably not Spain, as President Trump mentioned in his meeting with Chancellor Merz. But we know that countries will act in defense of their citizens, but they will not act in an offensive way, much the way the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom made very clear in his first address that the United States had nothing, the United Kingdom had nothing to do with the planning of this operation. They did not take part in the bombing of Iran at the very beginning, but he did come out in the days afterwards saying that they will support the defense of United Kingdom citizens all over the world.
And I'd like to talk about the upcoming elections. How could Trump's current policy affect the upcoming elections, especially the congressional elections, I mean?
Well, we saw that there was a 12-day war, as the Secretary of Defense likes to say, but the operation that happened last summer, Midnight Hammer, against Iranian nuclear facilities, that turned off a significant portion of President Trump's MAGA fans. So those who are decidedly not into interventionist policies did not vote for President Trump because they wanted to see more foreign interventions, and that left a sour taste in many. I think many of those supporters came back to President Trump after voicing their displeasure. But this is a full-scale military operation. We haven't had this many military assets in the Middle East since the Iraq War. This is clearly something that will absolutely have a negative impact. We're seeing that both from Republican voices and Democratic voices, not solely those who are simply against President Trump no matter what he does, but specifically about getting America involved into this war. We have seen radical right-wing voices already put out on the internet that they should have voted for the Democrats. They would have done a better job than President Trump. All they care about is their ideology going forward, which is a smaller America that doesn't send its resources overseas. And this is clearly an instance where President Trump is now going to have to turn to Congress after he has blown up the budget in his last legislation last year. He is going to once again turn to Congress for additional funding for a foreign war that nobody voted for.
And Trump has cut off trade relations with Spain. How do you assess these actions by the U.S. administration?
I think that we will see what happens with Spain in the end. There are many announcements that happen by President Trump on his social media platform that never go anywhere in the end. President Trump actually, with a presidential memorandum, announced that he was sanctioning the 9 of the top 10 law firms in the United States. Only last week, this has been happening for a year. Only last week, his Justice Department decided that they would not be willing to defend that in court anymore, and that disappeared completely. So as far as the sanctions against Spain, we will see if they actually happen in terms of stopping trade. If it does happen, how long will this last? And in the end, will the United States realize that stopping trade actually hurts the United States, not the other countries?
And to do this conflict with Iran, distracting attention from the Russia-Ukraine war?
I think that as far as resources, absolutely. I think the biggest after effect of this war is the fact that Steve Witkoff was negotiating with Iran up until Friday, and he told both the Iranians and the American people that an agreement was within sight. Specifically, the Iranian diplomats, the delegates who were meeting with Steve Witkoff, thought that there would be an agreement very shortly. So now you have a diplomat, quote unquote diplomat, Steve Witkoff, who doesn't have a trusted word. And that's the most important part of diplomacy, is being understood to be an honest broker. We know that these peace talks, such as they are between Russia, Ukraine, and the United States, are only done when the United States calls for them. So when the United States calls for them, who in that room is going to believe Steve Witkoff about anything he's saying, given the fact that he lied to a country to its face right before we decided to invade it?
And could Trump step back from trying to resolve our war because of Iran?
Well, I believe he stepped back already. I don't think that since October of last year, when he had he changed his mind about arming Ukraine with Tomahawks and had that meeting in the Oval Office following a phone call with President Putin. I don't believe that President Trump is taking a day-to-day or week-to-week interest in what's happening in Ukraine. He's leaving that to his subordinates, whether it's Steve Witkoff, whether it's Marco Rubio as the direct Secretary of State or the head of the National Security Administration. This is going to be a problem for his legacy if he has staked out so much that he could solve all these problems in the world, and he only seems to be making more. So his campaign rhetoric in 2024 was no new foreign wars. He has already invaded Venezuela and Iran just this year alone. And he also promised to lower prices. We all know that gas prices are going up right now. Gas and oil is going up, as is liquefied natural gas. And he also promised to figure out Ukraine within a day, also something that he cannot return on his promise. So this is going to be a very, very difficult thing for his congressmen and senators. It's the entire Congress is running for re-election, as well as 1/3 of the Senate. And they are not as talented as President Trump as far as deflecting all of these questions that I've mentioned. Where are the lower prices? Why did you start a new war? Why haven't you finished the war in Ukraine? What are you doing to make the Americans' lives better? President Trump can change the subject from one to the next very easily. But congressmen and senators, they don't have the unique skill that President Trump has of having no after effects, no follow-up questions about him. He will simply laugh things off and go on to another topic. That is not going to be possible for these senators and congressmen who are trying to achieve office.
Let's talk about Putin. Do you think Putin is afraid after Khamenei death he could be next?
I think so. I think this is something that he has constantly brought up with the United States and Ukraine's European allies. I was just reviewing some topics that I've been speaking on in 2022 and 23, and we remember how angry President Putin was about the fact that some drone was over the skies of St. Petersburg, over the presidential palace in Moscow as well. And this all feeds into the paranoia and fear of Putin, a person who will not, I firmly believe, not travel to any country in Europe. It was one thing to travel to Alaska. It's one thing to travel to China. He's not flying over another country. He's going directly from Russia to another country. But I don't believe he's going to go to a country like Switzerland or Italy or any proposed location for a summit. He will only remain in his own country, given the fact that he's so paranoid and afeared of being assassinated himself.
Was the strike on Iran also a blow to Putin's reputation as Iran's partner?
Well, we've seen Syria, we've seen Venezuela, we've seen a number of countries that have these security guarantees with Russia altogether fall apart. I think Cuba is likely to go next, given the fact that the United States has cut off their oil supply, whether from Venezuela or cutting off the tankers coming from Russia to resupply Cuba. It is only a matter of time until that country comes to some agreement with the United States. It is very clear that Putin's method of coordinating different countries to stand against the United States and the Western Alliance is at risk. And he becomes more and more then indebted to China, selling more gold reserves to China, not being able to meet his own budget, and more becoming a client state of China as opposed to this empire that he wanted to form by himself.
And how beneficial is this war for Russia in terms of higher oil prices?
Oh, that's the big question. Now, first and foremost, we know that they've been selling oil at a discount because they are not allowed to sell oil to most countries. But in terms of high oil prices, it might be a benefit if this wasn't partnered with the increasing attacks on oil refining facilities in Russia by the Ukrainian armed forces. The more Ukraine disrupts the production and refining of oil and petroleum products, the harder it is for Russia to sell. So even if the price of oil goes up temporarily, Russia is still going to be outputting less oil this year than it was last year.
And how do you see the situation developing in the Middle East? Could it lead to a larger war?
I believe that, number one, the United States does not know why it's in a war with Iran, and therefore it does not know when it needs to end it. Number two, it's very possible that President Trump, because of political reasons, will decide to end it from the side of the American side and possibly anger Israel for disengaging sooner. But the most important thing for people to keep an eye out is the deaths of Americans. That could be an increased deaths of Americans in combat, as we already have over 6 Americans who've been killed and even more wounded. But we know that also Iran is the, as President Trump says, #1 state sponsor of terror, and therefore their proxies all over the world, whether it's what Hezbollah is doing, attacking Israel right now, but more specifically, terrorist acts around the world that could happen is targeting American civilians. That will be the biggest change in narrative for this administration. How do they react to that? How do they maintain the rhetoric that they are making America safer than other presidents or administrations? That will deeply affect their narrative that they are the ones who can, they are the only ones who can protect Americans, which will then undercut their election rhetoric both in 2026 as well as 2028.
Mr. Dobriansky, thank you for this conversation, and I traditionally like to ask our viewers, please support us, press the button like under this video, please write where you're watching us from and leave your comments under this video. Andrij Dobriansky, expert at Center for U.S.-Ukrainian Relations, was the guest of the stream. Thank you.
Thank you.